Hello, my name is Jude Poyer. I'm a stuntman and film critic, and I live in Hong Kong.
My name is Miles Wood, and I'm also a film critic here in Hong Kong. And we're watching The Story of Ricky,
AKA Ricky O. This movie is based on a famous Japanese manga cartoon. The Chinese name is Lik Wong, which literally translates as Power King or Strength King. It's been known in the past as a god of knife, but I've never seen that print on that name on a print. I think perhaps somebody misread the Chinese because the character for Lik or power looks similar to the Chinese character Dou, which means knife.
Now, sharp-eyed viewers may notice that this doesn't really look like Hong Kong, and indeed this film is actually shot in Macau, which is an island about an hour's ferry ride away from Hong Kong.
Bit of Portuguese there above the prison.
Yes, it was a Portuguese colony, of course, until a couple of years ago when, like Hong Kong, it reverted back to the Chinese. And Macau is probably most used by Hong Kong people for gambling purposes. It has a lot of casinos there, and they go there to flutter away their money, because gambling is actually illegal in Hong Kong, except for betting on horse racing through the jockey club.
Macau is a real den of vice, I think, is one way to look at it. A lot of gangster films set there, like The Longest Night, and a Casino, which is one of my favourites, which was actually allegedly bankrolled by the gangster whose story it told.
Yeah, and a film called Marooned a couple of years ago made, I thought, very good use of the Macau building architecture and locations. Not a great film, but worth seeing just for the way it did use Macau, I think.
Macau is actually used often when filmmakers can't afford to go to Europe, but they need that look. Actually, a lot of model shoots, photography, fashion shoots that are meant to be taking place in Europe go to Macau for that Portuguese architecture. But we digress back to the Power King, Ricky O, a Japanese cartoon by Masahiko Takajo and Tetsuya Sarawatari. He did the artwork. Takajo did the story, and it's worth noting that Hong Kong doesn't really have much of a literary culture or book reading culture as such, but Hong Kong people are crazy about cartoon comic strips, and I'm not talking about things like the Beano. These things are definitely for adults. Chinese language ones which have been made into films, and also Japanese ones. Some other Japanese films, Japanese comics which have been made into Hong Kong films, include The Crying Freeman. Clarence Fock made a film called Dragon from Russia, inspired by The Crying Freeman, and Philip Goffey did a film which was a modern-day gangster film called Killer's Romance, which took its story from the Freeman comic books. And then, of course, Jackie Chan did City Hunter, which was a bit of a toned-down version of the character from compared to the Japanese version. The Japanese character of City Hunter is a bit of a pervert, I think you could say, where Jackie plays him as a bit more of a fun-loving playboy. And Clarence Fock actually was approached to direct this film, Story of Ricky, but I think perhaps he felt he'd done it before with Manga, with Dragon from Russia, and he turned it down, so the film ended up being directed by Lam Lai Choi, who we'll talk about a bit more later, a former cameraman with the Shaw Brothers. And here we get our first good look at the film star Louis Fan Siu Wong.
And we do get a good look, because the film actually freezes, if you notice there, to introduce each of the characters.
I remember the first time I saw Fan Siu Wong was actually in his third film. It was in the Yuen Biu movie, which was released in England as Above the Law, but also known as Righting Wrongs. And he played this very skinny juvenile delinquent. And I think that his social worker character was Yuen Biu's girlfriend in the film, so he had a very peripheral role, and he got a very nasty death. And about 5 years later, he turned up in this Stanley Tong film called Stone Age Warriors, and here's this huge buff guy with rippling muscles and amazing kung fu moves, and nobody could believe it was the same guy. And then he followed up Stone Age warriors with this film Story of Ricky, and I have to say he does bear quite a resemblance to the comic book character. Fancy Wong's story is interesting. His father was a kung fu actor, and we'll talk a bit more about him later. After he did those 3 movies where he was skinny and young, he went off to China, learnt wushu, learnt acrobatics, put on some bulk, and then came back. And I have to say, I think he's one of the best of the latter generation of martial art actors working in Hong Kong. His career really never made it to the A-list, and I think perhaps he blames this film for damaging his career. But he certainly had the kung fu ability, but never seemed to come across to the Hong Kong audiences. I talk to a lot of Hong Kongers, and they say he just doesn't look sophisticated enough.
Did you see any of his recent movies, Jude?
They're pretty poor, actually. But he is still... he tends to do movies shot in the Philippines, shot in Taiwan, and with poor box office. 2 interesting supporting players here.
Yeah, there on the left is Lam Soot. Who will be Lam Soot, of course, will be familiar to a lot of viewers who watch the Milky Way image films. He tends to crop up in virtually every film, I think, that Johnny To makes. Most recently, I think, Running Out of Time 2.
That's right. And it's an interesting story about Lam Soot. I heard that he's from the mainland. He came to Hong Kong to collect his grandfather's inheritance. He stayed, he spent his money, and then ended up working as a carpenter. And this story I read on the internet, I don't know if it's true, but he became friends with Lam Jing-ying. That's the famous Mr. Vampire. They used to play snooker together, and Lam Jing-ying introduced him to the film industry, and he started working as a props man. Now, here is an interesting thing. I found out from my other half that this guy getting beaten up is known as Zhang Se, and he used to appear on a TVB show giving domestic cleaning hints, like how to use certain things at home, like lemon and so on, to clean your shoes and things like that. He became so popular, Zhang Se, that he ended up doing movies as well. I think now we get an idea. If you thought you were in for a run-of-the-mill Hong Kong movie or Hong Kong prison movie, you know now you're in for something a little bit different.
Yes, I mean, I think the one thing about Story of Ricky, love it or hate it, and I'm sure it does elicit very polarised views from watchers, is that it is really totally unlike any other Hong Kong film, or maybe any other film in general. Really, it is quite a unique experience, and it's hard to think of anything quite like it. I think the recent Miki Takashi film, Ichi the Killer, which of course was also based on a Japanese manga, had similarities to it in its use of extreme violence and the humour.
Because manga, of course, is extremely graphically violent, and this film's basically just bringing it to life. It's bringing the pages of the comic book to life. I think a lot of that has to do with this movie was made in 1992. A few years earlier, the Category 3 rating was introduced to Hong Kong. Now, in Hong Kong, the rating system is very different from the UK. You've got Category 1, which is suitable for all, 2A, which is not suitable for children, and 2B, which is not suitable for young persons or children, and Category 3, which is for over 18s only. But basically, anybody of any age can go and see a 2A or a 2B film. Most films in Hong Kong, action films, fall into those 2 categories. So you can have a movie with unbelievable amounts of bloodletting, gangster movies, and a kid can go and see it. But certain films just about make the grade and become Category 3, and usually the criteria that gets a film slapped with a Category 3 rating is its sexual content. So, of course, a lot of filmmakers exploited that and made Category 3 soft porn films. And then also things like triad, depiction of the triads. If a film in Hong Kong, a gangster film, is shown to show triad rituals or certain triad behaviour that might encourage youngsters to join the gangs, that can mean youngsters can't go and see the films. And also things like drugs use. So Trainspotting, for example, was a Category 3 film in Hong Kong, merely because it showed people taking heroin and there was a reasonably explicit sex scene in it. But then again, certain films, a lot of more gorier movies, you know, a little kid off the street could go into the box office and buy a ticket to see. This is a film which knew that now that the Category 3 rating had been introduced, filmmakers could get away with a lot more. And this film thought, right, that's our selling point. We're going to make the most of it.
That said, I very much doubt if it were played in its full version of Hong Kong cinemas. It's neither of us were actually living in Hong Kong at the time, and we didn't see it theatrically. And I know I first saw it on its Hong Kong Laserdisc, which unfortunately doesn't use a subtitled theatrical print. So although the good thing about it is it's uncut, we can't judge from that whether the film actually played uncut in theatres.
That's it. There's lots of different butchered versions of the film depending on what territory you get it from. The VCD, the Hong Kong VCD of this film, which I watched in preparation to doing the audio commentary because I hadn't seen the film in a while, had all the gory scenes intact, but the most graphic shots all had this strange red filter on them, which kind of took away from the effect. So this film, though it was a Category 3 film, did get cut, and a Category 3 rating in Hong Kong doesn't guarantee you that the film will be left alone by the censors.
For example, The Untold Story, at the time there were a lot of kind of true life crime films being made, such as Dr. Lam, The Untold Story, and many of those also suffered at the hands of Hong Kong censors when they were shown theatrically. But the censorship system in Hong Kong means that it's really the total reverse of what it is in the UK, where censors are really worried about what kids could see on video when they're unsupervised at home. In Hong Kong, actually, a film doesn't have to be classified for its home video release. They can release a film totally uncut. And the reason that some films are released cut on video is simply because the distributor can't be bothered to go back and find an uncut version. It's just easier for them to use a theatrical print to make the transfer.
That's right, and also the way films are censored in Hong Kong is quite different in that members of the public will often be brought in to watch the films and make their decision as to what kind of rating the film should receive.
Which is perhaps how some of Wong Jing's scatological humour gets by in films
under the net.
Yeah, that's okay for children, obviously, in Hong Kong.
I think we get a taste of why this is quite a dodgy prison, in that the inmates do seem to be able to walk around at will any hour of the day, if so it pleases them.
Yeah, I think the film actually embraces its kind of comic book sensibilities right from the start. It never attempts to make this a realistic prison drama. I mean, even you think of the New World films that Roger Corman was producing in the 70s, those women in prison films. They were pure exploitation, but they had some kind of semblance of reality to them, perhaps. But this is just really totally out there.
Like the toy wooden train which he manages to keep under his shirt. As the film progresses, you'll find these prisoners manage to keep all kinds of objects concealed under their clothing and then just whip them out at the right moment. Yeah, Fancy Wong showing off his newly acquired wushu skills there. Probably getting very, very cold and wet in the process because they don't heat that water up in Hong Kong. Now, any scene in a prison washrooms, begs trouble. Whether the film's The Black Sheep Affair, a Hong Kong film, or American History X, somebody's in trouble. But as this scene turns out, we're in for penetration of a different kind.
Yeah, the problem is because it's not a women in prison film, you can't really use nudity as being a selling point, which is what the shower scene is normally there for.
Yeah, Fancy Wong, interestingly enough, his hairdresser does get a credit at the end of this film. He seems to be going for the Robin Shou Mortal Kombat look here. And for those who want to know, the hair salon which sponsored him, Hair, is situated in Causeway Bay, and they do a lot of sponsoring for artists. I walked past Hair the Sunday before last, and loads of teeny bopper fans outside. I didn't realise, but it was the Miss Hong Kong pageant that night, and all the stars were there getting their haircuts. Oh!
And here we have a good example of some of the extreme gore that is really sprinkled throughout this movie. I mean, as I said earlier, this really is totally unlike any other Hong Kong film. I mean,
Ow!
It really, the use of gore is kind of almost goes back to Herschel Gordon Lewis, the kind of the father of the splatter movie in the US, and I suppose reminds you also of Peter Jackson's Brain Dead, which was released the same year as this, and that also was pretty extreme in its use of gore. What's interesting is it doesn't try to look realistic. I think this is partly perhaps a Japanese sensibility where effects in Japanese films aren't meant to mimic reality. And I think this is a problem a lot of Western viewers have with them. I mean, you can even compare it to something like the Godzilla films or something where Western viewers generally kind of laugh at the effects and say, oh, look at, that absurd little train or something like that. Well, the whole point is that Japanese viewers don't expect things to look real. They appreciate the effects on their own terms.
It's like Shogun Assassin with the big fountains of red blood shooting out of the necks.
Yeah, and of course that is also carries over into Japanese manga, and therefore also carries over into this film as well. So I think the effects were never meant to look realistic. They were just meant to be kind of extreme.
But I have to say, I'm even though I am amazed by the advances made in technology, the computer CGI and so on, I still find a lot of prosthetic effects work better on screen than the computer ones, especially involving skin, because the way light works off the texture of skin is something which is very hard to reproduce on a computer. So the shot, like, for example, where Ricky pulled the spike out of his hand, we know that's a prosthetic coming up the bottom of the frame, but it works better for me. And what we were seeing there was Ricky was actually doing some internal healing kung fu, some qigong there, and that's what his character actually learns in the film is qigong, which is, when people talk about the martial arts, you have the external arts and the internal arts. The external ones, things like karate and Wing Chun kung fu, where the power is coming outwards. The internal arts are ones which use your body's qi, and it's called ki in Japanese, and basically that's your internal energy. As one kung fu guy said in an interview, it's muscles you can't see. Everybody has muscles, but you have to train them to make them big. If you want your qi, your internal energy, to work, you have to train that too. And you will see people doing daft things like snapping spears on their necks and things like that, and smashing concrete slabs over their shins. They call that qi because, of course, there's no muscles on the shin to protect you.
And I should come in here and say the elderly gentleman you see on your screens is Tetsuro Tamba, who's a very famous Japanese actor, actually. He's been making films for 50 years probably now. He can be seen in the original Kwaidan back in the 60s, and he was also in a number of Sonny Chiba films, which I imagine quite a few viewers of this may have seen.
I think there's a Sonny Chiba reference at the end of this movie too.
Right. He's in Bullet Train and Samurai Reincarnation. And then most recently he was in Miki Takashi's Happiness of the Katakuris. But he did star in some Hong Kong films as well. He was in Chang Cheh's All Men Are Brothers, alongside Fan Su Wong's father, of course.
That's right.
So it almost seems like perhaps this director is kind of assembled his cast for this film quite carefully. Several of the actors actually are in his other films, so I don't think it's like a haphazardly put together film. I mean, the choice of Tetsuro Tamba to play this part is obviously not insignificant. So maybe the film isn't quite as cheap and throwaway as some people would perhaps like to think it is.
So, and the director, Lam Lai Choi, like I said, he's better known as a cameraman. And some people have criticised his films because the direction isn't that spot on. I think part of that, though, is to do with the fact of the schedule and the budgets of the films involved. We see a lot of cameraman cinematographers in Hong Kong going on to be directors. For example, Andrew Lau Wai Keung. Now, he started off as a cameraman, even shot for Wong Kar-wai, and now he's directed movies like The Avenging Fist and A Man Called Hero and Storm Riders, which are also comic book films. Peter Powell, who of course shot the film Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, has got his movie The Touch starring Michelle Yeoh coming out. Some people always seem a bit dubious when they hear a director of photography is making his directorial debut, but I can say from my experience, I think sometimes the cameramen actually have more experience directing actors on some films than the directors do themselves. They tend to stay behind the monitor and bark instructions to their assistant directors or so, and sometimes it's the cameraman who will help the actors look their best and do their best.
Well, Lam Nai-Cho's got a fairly impressive list of credits to his name. I think he's obviously a kind of genre specialist. He's best known for, I suppose, The Seventh Curse, really, and then The Peacock King and its sequel, Saga of the Phoenix. But I think probably his best film was Her Vengeance, which was a very gritty rape revenge melodrama with Pauline Wong and Lam Ching-ying, and that is a film I would heartily recommend anybody check out, although I think it's a pretty difficult one to see. I know the Hong Kong release doesn't have any subtitles, but Her Vengeance, highly recommended.
Now this man, believe it or not, Fan Moi-sang, is actually our star Fan Siu-wong's father. Comes from the mainland. He entered the Hong Kong film business in 1965 and was basically a kung fu actor. He's not that easily recognizable in this film because he usually sports very long hair and a very untidy beard. I think kung fu fans will know him from films like The Young Master, The Postman Strikes Back, and he also appeared in Magnificent Butcher. He replaced Yuen Woo-ping's father, Yuen Siu-tin. Yuen Siu-tin passed away just a few days into shooting the film, and Fan Moi-sang took the part over. Now, Fan Moi-sang and his son, Louis Fan, actually very, very close. You will often see them hanging out together. I remember working on a TVB series which Fan Siu-wong co-starred in, and his father was always on the set, just hanging around, and he still looks very recognizable as he did in those kung fu movies, not like he does now. Mainstream audiences may remember seeing Fan Moi-sang in Michael Cimino's Year of the Dragon.
Although I think it was a fairly small part.
I think he got his head cut off in it.
Right.
Not a film which a lot of Hong Kong actors were that keen to work on, actually. I spoke to Sally Yip recently, Sally Ye, and she said she cast for the film, but she found that its depiction of Chinese to be something quite undesirable, so she didn't want to know about it. But Fan Moi-sang, he definitely did. Now, I think the young man is trying not to laugh because he's acting opposite his father.
I think there's a hint of a grin appearing on his face there. And if you look behind him here, you can see a lot of porn videos on the wall.
Japanese AV. And also I've got lamps just like that in my living room, but that's quite disturbing.
So the set decoration is somewhat tongue-in-cheek, I think we can say here.
In the German version of this film, the mints that Fan Moi-sang takes out of his eye are changed, and they're dubbed, they're turned into drugs. I personally think someone with such little personal hygiene caring about the smell of their breath is actually quite amusing. There you go. And I think he's still trying to suppress the laughter there, getting beaten up by his old man. And one thing we notice about this film is no matter how much punishment Riccio takes, this guy does not scar. He heals quickly. Now, of course, you might say that that's the internal kung fu working. You might just say it's they couldn't be bothered to worry about the continuity with the makeup. Like you said, Miles, that this isn't a movie which goes out of its way to be realistic. But one thing I do wonder about is where the film is actually set, because it is a Japanese comic. It's not clearly Hong Kong. And also, if just then we saw a poster behind Fan Moi-sang, and that was simplified Chinese characters, which is the Chinese alphabet, if I can use that word, used in the mainland. So it could be China, could be Hong Kong. It's in the future, or it was at least. And that motion there is called a butterfly twist.
Yeah.
Nice wushu motion there.
Are his martial arts skills quite developed?
Fancy, like I said, right now when I think about the kung fu actors working in Hong Kong, obviously a lot of them have gone overseas, or we can say that they're past their prime, even if they're good performers. But I would say Fan Siu Wong and Chiu Man Chuk are the last two real martial arts stars left in Hong Kong, although they're not really stars. They never really hit that A grade for that long. But his kung fu is fantastic. I was there when he shot a kung fu demonstration, which is included as an extra feature on this DVD, and the guy really, really can move. And we'll see on this film that no stunt double required, which is probably a good thing because he's such a big chap. It'd be very difficult, and he's got his shirt off. It'd be very difficult to have a double for him. But he's doing a lot of his action himself, not just the kung fu stuff, but also taking a lot of the knocks. He really is a fantastic physical performer, not just with the kung fu and the acrobatics. He can do the weapons and everything. I think Daddy had him trained well.
The problem is, I guess, though, in Hong Kong these days, is there really a need for an actor to have those skills? I mean, 10 years ago it was requisite, but now with CGI and it really has almost become redundant, would you say?
I don't know if it's a CGI problem. I think it's a problem with the producers in that we don't have the time and the budget to craft really extravagant action scenes most of the time, and a lot of the talent coming up just isn't up to it. And they'd rather get a good-looking, handsome face who'll bring girls into the cinema than somebody who can really fight. I mean, I used to love watching Chang Che's kung fu movies. If I saw that the leading cast were pig ugly, I knew I was going to get some good kung fu.
Right.
And speaking of somebody that most people would say is not pig ugly, here we see our leading lady, Gloria Yip Wan Yi, who I think probably worked only about 2 days on this film. Very popular in Japan, this girl, or at least she was. Maybe because some people say she looks Japanese. And she did work with Lam Nai Choi before on Peacock King, Saga of the Phoenix, which starred Yun Bu.
And she's also in The Cat, which was the director's final film, I believe. I think he just did that one other film after this.
Hong Kong Legends fans can also see one of her better performances in Miracles, the Jackie Chan film. She was only in the Hong Kong movie-making business for about 5 years, and very prolific at that time, very popular. And then she got married, and as a lot of actresses do in Hong Kong, she retired. But she's recently divorced and has spoken about moving back into the entertainment circle. She recently did some advertisements for some diet centres or weight loss programs, which seem to be what a lot of retired actresses are doing these days before they make a comeback. And just a little bit of trivia. Gloria Yip's nickname is Ying Ying, which means firefly.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
This guy we're seeing here is Chan Ging, usually typecast as robber from the mainland. He was popular on TVB and comedy shows, and also he often ended up playing the hams up low, or you could say the sex maniac character in a lot of TV series. But his best role probably was in Johnny Mac's Long Arm of the Law, which is a really superior piece of Hong Kong filmmaking. And the man we see entering stage right, or rather to the left of your screen, is Philip Kwok Choi, the film's action director and a veteran kung fu star. We could talk about him for a very long time. A Taiwanese opera performer, he was discovered by director Zhang Jit and brought over to work at the Shaw Brothers Studios as a stuntman. Originally, he doubled for Alexander Fusheng for a while, and then he got his chance to act in some truly fantastic Hong Kong films like Five Deadly Venoms and Kid with a Golden Arm. After the Shaw Brothers closed down, he stayed mainly with TVB, working as an action director, and followed Cheng Siu-dong for a while, learning wire techniques and so forth, which he used. He was an assistant action director on a Chinese ghost story. John Woo hired him to action direct Hard Boiled, and he played a character in that, Mad Dog, a very righteous triad hitman I think John Woo probably remembered him from working with him when John Woo was Zhang Zhe's assistant director.
Yeah, so his career really has spanned the generations.
That's right. More recently, he's been known for choreographing Michelle Yeoh's fight scene in Tomorrow Never Dies, the James Bond film. He wasn't given creative control over the camera angles and the cuts in that scene. I know he wasn't happy. He had a blink and you'll miss him walk-on appearance in that film. I think he was called General Zhang. He was like a Red Army general that was doing dodgy deals with Jonathan Pryce. More recently, he got some acclaim for his choreography work on the French film Brotherhood of the Wolf, starring Marc Dacascos, and his latest film is The Touch, starring Michelle Yeoh, which he also did the fight choreography for, but he also worked most of the time at TVB.
Not that there's really that much fight choreography in The Touch, it has to be said. Did you see Brotherhood of the Wolf, Jude?
I did. Yeah. And I heard a good story about that. Was Marc Dacascos was telling this story in the press that one day when they were doing rehearsals, one of the stunt team sort of said to him, one of the French stuntmen said to him, "Okay, well, we've seen what your stunt team can do, but what can you do?" And it wasn't said in an obnoxious way. And apparently Philip Kwok, who must be middle-aged now, took his cigarette out of his mouth, gave it to his assistant, and just went straight away with no warm-up into some very impressive tumbling and acrobatics. So the guy can still move.
I thought Brotherhood of the Wolf was an interesting film for like about half its running time. And then when it was revealed what the monster was, I thought it kind of really lost its way rather, but... An interesting example of kind of the influence of Hong Kong cinema on films being made elsewhere in the world. I mean, it kind of just shows really that, overseas films are perhaps more Hong Kong than Hong Kong films these days.
That's
I
right.
mean, you won't get something like that being made in Hong Kong today. We're more interested in seeing twins really being romanced by handsome boys.
Well, you might be.
I'm speaking Hong Kong collectively. I confess I haven't seen the Twins movies either, Jude. So.
And it does seem that internationally filmmakers want to get that Hong Kong style into their films.
Yeah.
I met a French director called Pitoff, and he directed a film called Vidocq, starring Gérard Depardieu, which they shot in high definition. And that film had a couple of fight scenes in it, which included a lot of high kicks and a bit of acrobatics. And he said, my producers asked me, how can we have this in a French movie set in the 19th century? And I said, well, we have French savate, our own martial art. He just wanted to get it in there. And here we have a scene which you probably won't see in any sensitive French art house movies. But one that is talked about. This is one of those scenes which, when you finally see the payoff, as it were, it makes its impression on you. I think a lot of people perhaps can remember their first sighting of this movie. I remember I was at a Chinese friend's house and they put in this blurry black and white colour-bleeding bootleg. And then I saw this scene and it made an impression.
Well, I remember first seeing this on Laserdisc. A friend in the UK lent it me, and it was a film I felt I had to see. And I confess the first time I watched it didn't leave a favourable impression on me. But I've kind of revised my opinion now. I think once you know what to expect, you approach the film in a very different light. And it's interesting that the film did get such a reputation. I mean, it was one of those films that for a long time you felt like you had to see. I mean, I'm going back kind of 8 or 9 years here, really, when I was first getting into Hong Kong films. And, you have to see all the John Woos and the Ringo Lambs and things like that. I mean, those are what were popular overseas. But this film was rated up there with them. I mean, it kind of achieved a kind of sort of legendary status. People were talking about the various versions that were available. Oh, you can only get the full version on the unsubtitled Hong Kong Laserdisc because all the subtitle tapes are all cut. And
that was the thing, even more so to its credit, most of the movies, Hong Kong movies that got seen on tape in the UK were pirated.
Uh-huh.
And for the fact that a film which most of the videotape versions boasted no subtitles but still managed to garner such a reputation means that this film did have quite an impact.
Indeed. It's probably hard for listeners to understand these days, in this day and age of the internet and DVD, where information's so easy to come by. And really, a Hong Kong film, you can probably see it on DVD a month after it's been released in theatres. But back then, we really had very little first-hand knowledge of what was coming out in Hong Kong, and it was very difficult to actually see the films. Probably more so in England than perhaps in the United States.
The more I watch this, and obviously we see people like Kwok Choi, Fan Moi Sang, I do think that Lam Lai Chai was influenced heavily by his Shaw Brothers days. I know he cast Gordon Liu, Lau Ga Fai in one of the Peacock King films with Yuen Biu, and this kind of scene with the garroting of the intestines, or the intestines used to kill the opponent, it reminds me of the kind of thing that Jimmy Wang Yu would go through, where he'd fight 50 opponents and he'd pull out his intestines and wrap them round his waist and tie them in a knot and carry on fighting. That's the Sonny Chiba reference.
Right.
I was talking about the X-ray of the bone breaking, which was used quite recently, I think, in... was it Romeo Must Die? They used that for Jet Li.
Oh, right.
Busting people's bones. Sonny Chiba did it first.
Yeah.
Sonny Chiba was a man who wasn't afraid to, rupture a few internal organs or pull out the genitals and hold them up to the camera. All good family entertainment. I think this film also boasts some of the worst extras I've ever seen. It looks like they've been told one gesture they have to do, and then they repeat doing it. Later on, you see them gesturing with their hand toward the center of the shot, and they just keep doing the same gesture for the rest of the film. Now, this isn't the only film that Fan Siu Wong played with his father. They both appeared in an interesting movie from Yi Tong Sang called Master of Zen, which told the story of Da Mo, or Tamo, or Bodhidharma, depending on what name you use, who was the Indian monk that not only founded Chinese Kung Fu in China, but also discovered, could you say, Zen Buddhism. Yeah. And here we see, for the more interesting characters in the film, I'm not sure what the Japanese comic book called them, but the Cantonese used to describe these guys are the Sei Dai Tin Wong. Now, including the bloke who just got croaked, that would translate as the Four Heavenly Kings. I think that is a topical reference and joke because at the time the four biggest canto pop stars in Hong Kong were Aaron Kwok Fu Seng, Andy Lau Dat Wah, Jackie Cheung Hok Yao, and Leon Lai Ming, and those four guys still are considered the Four Heavenly Kings. When I look at the character played by Yukori Oshima, her haircut, and the fact that she's got a bloke's voice, I think there is an Aaron Kwok reference going on there, and I think that's something to make the audiences have a bit of a cackle. But then again, Miles, you were saying that her character does quite closely resemble the original comic book artwork as well.
Well, I believe so. I confess I've not actually seen the original comic book, but I have the Laserdisc at home, and on it does have what I presume is the original artwork from the comic. And most of the characters actually don't look much like the originals, but yes, the guy, shall we say, played by Yukari Oshima, does look remarkably similar to how she looks in this film.
But does sport the same haircut that Aaron Kwok was sporting at the time. Now, I don't know quite why they wanted to throw in this sort of gentle subplot into the movie at this time. Maybe Lam Lai Chai thought it was necessary that the audience catch a gentle breather, or maybe this is meant to be the emotional heart of the film. But one thing I do notice is that Fan Siu Wong's haircut looks a wee bit shorter in length.
You're right.
In this scene. So maybe this was a reshoot. Maybe this was added later. Because when we saw this character isolated, having seen his godfather being killed, he was on his own.
Uh-huh.
And he was probably holding up that chicken wire fence that was meant to be keeping him in. So I think maybe this was a reshoot that the producers thought needed to be added in because this film is pretty intense and heavy on the gore.
Perhaps it just wasn't long enough for commercial release. They just needed to pad out the running time a bit.
Well, that does happen. You see a lot of low-budget Hong Kong films these days, and it has to be said, a lot of Hong Kong films these days are shot in 8 days or less. And sometimes you'll see a character go for a drive in his car, and that's an excuse for someone to stick an Arriflex camera out of a car window and get some shots to pad out the running time. Now, where did he get all those leaves from that were sitting on his lap? And after this film, Story of Ricky, Fan Siu Wong, like I said, never really made it to the A grade. His next film was for Stanley Tong once again. Stanley Tong had hired him for Stone Age Warriors, which is a bit of an Indiana Jones sort of jungle adventure. The next movie he did was Project S for Stanley Tong, which has also been called Super Cop 2 and also been called Once a Cop, and it's a sequel to Police Story 3, or a spin-off of sorts. Didn't get all that much to do in that movie, but got to go toe-to-toe with Dick Wei, show off some more modern, contemporary kung fu action. And then after that, he started to do movies for Danny Lee Xiaoyin's film company Magnum, including Organized Crime and Triad Bureau, Fearless Match, Portrait of a Serial Rapist, and a title that I love, Water Tank Murder Mystery. But he seemed a bit uneasy playing those cop roles because he's a wushu stylist, which is a, how can you say, very aesthetic form of kung fu. It looks kind of out of place in Danny Lee's contemporary cop action films.
Did he work a lot in TV?
He did. In I think it was 1995 or 96, he signed on. Probably 95, he signed on with TVB. Had some success. He did a film, Lam Tai Bat Kun, or rather Lam Kun Batoi, I should say, which is Northern Leg Southern Fist, where he acted opposite Moon Lee, and that was a kung fu period piece. But it seems like TVB really didn't know what to do with him apart from those kung fu TV series. And then his last film in 1995, and then it was another 2 years, which was after TVB, that he made his next film, which was a Taiwanese movie called Death Games, which was produced by William Lan, who's made such cult classics as Death Cage, which was Robin Shou in his first starring role. And that movie was very low budget. It made in 1997 when Hong Kong martial art action films as we know were sort of beginning to decline or wind down. Even though it's very low budget, it boasts some fantastic action and really is worth seeking out if you can get it. I know there's VCD versions around. Now that big guy is definitely Japanese. I don't know whether he's famous in Japan. Like we said, this film's got a couple of Japanese performers in it, like Yokori, and I think maybe that guy was brought in maybe because they couldn't find such a huge performer in Hong Kong. There's not many Cantonese actors of that stature.
Yeah, we've actually been unable to determine whether there was any Japanese money in this film. A lot of sources. I don't think there
was much money in this film anyway.
But a lot of sources kind of describe this film as a Japanese Hong Kong co-production, but it's difficult to determine whether that's the case. I mean, there certainly are a few Japanese faces in the cast, which perhaps indicates that they had an eye on the Japanese market. I'm not sure.
Like I said, Gloria Yip is very popular in Japan at the time, and she's got a real throwaway role, really. You feel that she's just in there to have her name on the poster and get the Japanese punters in.
I think the casting of Yukari Ashima is an interesting one. It's not every day you cast a woman in the role of a man in any sort of film.
Unless it's Bridget Lamtingha playing the role.
Yeah, unless it's Bridget Lin, where you're deliberately trying to create some sort of gender confusion. But here it works. It works quite well, I think. I mean, Yukari Ashima was probably at the height of her popularity, I would think, at this time. I mean, she'd been introduced to Hong Kong audiences and Western audiences as well. I guess about 86 when she appeared in Angel, and she was very much part of a flourishing genre, which was often called the girls with guns films, where you had people like Moon Lee and Elaine Lai and
Cynthia Rothrock,
yeah,
Sharon Young Pan Pan, and so on. Yukari Oshima's another one who never really made it to the A-list. She did appear in A-grade pictures, you could say, like Shanghai Express, the Sammo Hung film in which she plays sort of a Japanese samurai warrior. She also has a very small part in Project S, but usually she found more meaty roles in Hong Kong B-movies, films produced by the likes of Philip Goffey, films like Hard to Kill, which is also known as The Interpol Connection, and Fatal Chase, which starred Robin Shou. And those movies were actually Hong Kong-Filipino co-productions. And Yukari Oshima, even to this day, has quite a large following in the Philippines, where she's known as Cynthia Luster.
That's right,
which is obviously to cash in on the Cynthia Rothrock, Cynthia Khan connection. But the luster, they mean as in the luster of gold, but the way that they spell it is as if it's of one who lusts.
Yes.
And that sounds like a bit of a porno star name. So she's not known as Yukori. Her Cantonese name, by the way, is Daido Yokale, and she's known as Daido. But she's Cynthia Luster in the Philippines. And the last I saw of her was, I think, in 1997 on Star TV, which is a satellite TV network owned by Rupert Murdoch, which broadcasts throughout Asia. And she was on there promoting her home city of Fukuoka in Japan. And since then, she's sort of disappeared into obscurity. She started off as a stunt woman in Japan, trained in the Sunny Chiba Stunt School. She was a karate action actress and used to double, made the move over to Asia, worked in Taiwan and Hong Kong movies, and like you said, Miles made a real impact in that film Angels, which I think was originally released in the UK as Iron Angels.
That's right, yeah.
As the villainess. That was one of a very early Charlie's Angels kind of rip-off movie. She made an impact in that and just kept on working. And it's funny, I hear a lot of Hong Kong stuntmen and stunt coordinators talk about which action actresses can really do the action. They speak very highly of Moon Lee. They speak very highly of Michelle Yeoh. And then I remember on one occasion I said, well, what about Daido? What about Yukori? And they said, we don't think of her as a woman, we think of her as a man. I think maybe because she didn't start off as a dancer like Michelle or Moon Lee, but she was a stunt performer, and she takes her knocks and gets in there more like with the attitude of a stunt person than an actress. One thing that's worth noting about this film, which makes the action even harder to perform for Fan Siu Wong and also for Frankie Chan, that big muscle guy we saw earlier, is they're stripped to the waist. Now, for obvious reasons, that makes it harder to do the wire work because that means the harness has to be around your pelvic area so that it can't be seen. You can't wear a harness around your shoulders because it would be obviously on camera. Another thing is, when you do action movies, you like to wear pads on your elbows and forearms and chest and wherever you're taking any kind of impact. Even if you're just blocking punches and kicks, you'll be wearing forearm pads. If you're doing it bare-chested, you'll find you pick up an awful lot more bruises. So, and we see that later on. And also, we do see some of the ways in which, I guess, Philip Kwok Gok Choi tried to minimize the risk of injury for the actors or the discomfort. For example, the sand we just saw that Fan Siu Wong landed into on the ground will take some of the impact out of the fall. And also, you'll find sometimes concrete floors, they'll actually put down thin grey-coloured mats, rubber mats on the floor, just to take some of the power out of the impact. In some of Jackie Chan's films, you can actually see his characters maybe wearing a T-shirt or a singlet, and then he'll put on a blazer or a jacket, and then a fight scene comes up. And it's because if you're going to shoot a fight scene without the ability to wear protective padding, it can make it quite an unpleasant experience or harder on the body than it ordinarily would be. But also here, like I said, we've got that added problem of where to put the wire harnesses. Now, some of the harnesses people wear to do stunts in Hollywood are jerk vests, they're called, are very, very strong vests which can cover most of the torso, kind of the thing that Tom Cruise wore in that scene in Mission Impossible where he's dangling down. In Hong Kong, a wire harness can just be a single cord wrapped around someone's private parts. It's good for wedges. So it's not the most flattering outfit for Yukari Oshima.
No, I was wondering, do you think that's hiding padding, or
could be hiding padding, hiding the harness, or might just be a reference to her comic book character. I know
or it may just be bad costume design.
Might be bad costume design, but I know that she had quite a lot of red-blooded fans, male fans, back in the UK during her heyday. In Angel, there was a scene in which her character bared a breast, but I think there's absolutely no reason to believe that it wasn't a body double. That's about as risque as she got. And that kind of editing we see there is kind of Cheng Su-dong style of multiple cuts. I think maybe a Kwok Choi influence there. A lot of action directors in Hong Kong at this time did call the shots during the action scenes. They said, this is where the camera goes, this is how much of the action we shoot, and then we cut here and we do the next shot. It's worth pointing out most Hong Kong action films don't shoot in the Hollywood style, which is shoot a master of a whole fight scene and have 5 or 6 cameras shooting it and then come in and punch in with a few close-ups handheld. They tend to do it in montage, shoot shot by shot, section by section, and I think we're seeing some of that here. With wire work and some of the action we see in this film involving mini trampolines and wires to perform one action, you need to call the shots. You can't just leave it up to the DOP and the director to shoot it how they like. Now, why didn't he do that earlier? That reminds me of the old Leung Ga-yan film, Canton Iron Kung Fu. And that's actually one of the many Qigong tricks you'll see people do, is wrap metallic wire around their bodies and then snap it. Well, this is an interesting set. There's certain shots in this film, scenes that suggest they were actually done in studios. But if you look at the end credits, you'll find that the Macau prison is credited, but also a couple of libraries in Sha Tin were used.
Uh-huh.
And I think they worked between a real penal institution, those libraries, and studio sets as well to create this prison. But
they didn't take advantage of the library to have any scenes in any prison libraries anyway. There's certainly no books appearing in this. I guess maybe for scenes like this, and it could easily be the back stairs of a library or something. All the sets are very, very Spartan, aren't they? There's really no extra dressing gone into them at all.
Now, a shot like that, you might think the actor really gets stamped on, but usually the way to do it is a stuntman will put a boot or his arm through a trouser leg, put a boot on the end of his hand, and just give a light tap to the person he's hitting. But I remember when I first started watching Hong Kong films, I kept thinking, wow, these guys are getting booted in close-up, but usually it's a bit more gentle than real life. Now that looks more like Hong Kong to me. That looks more like rural Hong Kong. The film, like I said, was not shot completely on location in Macau. They did shoot in the New Territories in Hong Kong. In fact, I worked on an American film, which I think was released as Return to Paradise. It starred Vince Vaughn and Anne Heche, about... well, part of it was about a prison in Malaysia, and obviously it was about the death penalty, so they couldn't shoot those scenes in Malaysia. And in Sha Tin, which is in the New Territories, they actually constructed a prison set in an empty field. Mm-hmm. So I don't think they had the luxury of that kind of budget on this movie.
They've rolled out the red carpet, so here we have a couple of new characters being introduced into the film. Here's the first one.
Yeah, this chap, played by actor William Ho Ga Koi. Now, he usually gets cast in real sleazeball characters, triad bosses, perverts, serial killers. You name it. I don't know much about this man. I've tried to find out. The only thing I do know is from somebody who actually met him, said that even though he does play these kind of sleazeball, reprehensible characters, he's a real gentleman in real life and speaks very, very good English. So quite different from the characters he plays in real life, in the movies.
I don't think either of us have got any idea who this fat kid is, though.
But I actually think he's the most revolting special effect in the film.
He is truly loathsome.
I think a lot of the costuming budget went on Holger Koi's outfits. Everybody else just in their regulation blue uniforms. Or black uniforms if they're playing a prisoner.
Yeah.
Probably didn't even bother to wash them between shooting days.
And it's been about 5 minutes since we've had a gory effect. It's time for another one. I think the filmmakers certainly knew what they were going for. They knew what the main appeal of this film would be.
I'm going to keep making these Shaw Brothers references, but the more I watch this film, the more it reminds me of Zhang Zhe's Cripple Avengers, which is also known as Mortal Kombat in the States, and I think it's released as Return of the Five Venoms on DVD. That's the title anyway. And you see a lot of this real sadistic mutilation, chopping off of limbs and gouging of eyes and people in pain. All good, healthy stuff.
Do you think that sort of thing is appealing to Hong Kong audiences? Is there some reason we kind of see that here and in other films from Hong Kong? Or, I mean, I don't think they're aiming at an overseas audience for this film, are they? So,
well, I mean, like we said, the manga cartoons are extremely explicit sexually as well as in terms of the violence. And I think people maybe thought that if you're going to make a manga movie, you shouldn't cop out. And once again, it's a Category 3 film, which at the time was a gimmick.
Yeah.
It's, look, we can get away with things that 5 years away we couldn't have. So that was part of the selling point. I mean, I know that after Jackie Chan made City Hunter, actor Michael Chow decided he didn't like the way that had been done. He thought that it was a toned-down, Hong Kong-friendly version, and he thought it's high time somebody made the definitive City Hunter movie, and he went ahead with his independent film Mr. Mumble, which was a bit more true to the comic book roots, a bit more racy, but nothing really shocking.
Yeah, I thought it was quite an entertaining little movie.
It was an entertaining little film. Didn't do well at the box office, but that's the thing we find here is a lot of Hong Kong movies that gain a reputation and are considered cult classics weren't always the ones that did well. Some of them actually bombed. I mean, if you look at action movies that are real fan favourites from the 80s and 90s, films like Eastern Condors and Tiger Cage 2, even Ringo Lam's Burning Paradise, they either performed well below expectations or they bombed. They didn't find their audience in Hong Kong, but they found their audience overseas, thanks to Laserdisc, videotape, and of course good old-fashioned bootlegging.
Yeah, and that applies to some of Yukari Oshima's films as well. I mean, I think films like Dreaming the Reality and Mission of Justice, which are a couple of favourites of mine from that time. I think you mentioned those to any Hong Kong film critic or even just a general, Hong Kong film viewer, and they won't know what you're talking about. Right. It's like these films are really, have gone by totally unnoticed by everybody in Hong Kong, but they just happen to get picked up by an audience overseas that was at the time looking for something a bit different and just kind of found it in Hong Kong cinema.
I have to say, this geezer is very, very ungrateful because Ricky O saved his bacon just a few scenes ago, and now he's going to kill the guy again. Just doesn't make much sense. I don't know, but sense isn't all that important with a film. Logic has no place in a Hong Kong manga adaptation.
It's interesting what you were saying about Category 3 films a few minutes ago. Category 3 almost became a kind of subgenre of its own in the West.
Certainly in the view of the fans, yes.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, people were buying films simply because they were Category 3. I mean, the rating covered any number of types of films.
Run and Kill was one.
Yeah.
I met the producer of that last year, and he said, this is a movie that we're having real trouble distributing even now because in a lot of foreign territories, a lot of markets, the distributors won't even consider to buy the film because they know it'll get cut or banned by the censors. So they lost money on that movie. But one again, it's a fan favourite and very intense.
Yeah. And
kids getting burnt and stuff.
Right, and people don't know.
Oh! Oh, that hurt. And now we're going to see that this tall Japanese actor doesn't know how to fall properly onto a hard floor. Look at the way his head smashes into the ground. Ouch. And that floor would have been better off padded. If you're going to hit the floor as stiff as a board, you should try and tuck your chin into your solar plexus, or just tuck your chin in, otherwise you're going to get knocked out. And I think that guy probably did by that landing.
Oh, right. Well, yeah, that's something a stunt man such as you, Jude, would, I guess, notice. Perhaps not as ordinary viewers. Just backing up for a minute, we were just talking about Run and Kill and the kind of reception of these kind of films overseas. I spoke to the scriptwriter of Run and Kill, who is actually a fairly famous film critic here in Hong Kong and is more recently turned film director. And he was quite surprised that the film did have a reputation overseas, and he was in no way really wanted it to be on his resume. I think he was kind of quite embarrassed by it. So it's interesting, the writer of such a cult favourite, but over here it's not seen as in such a positive light. I guess it's just kind of seen as an unpleasant exploitation movie.
And you do hear about directors in Hong Kong saying, I made this one for my kids, I made this one for my bank manager, and I made this film for me. And I just guess directors aren't that picky in Hong Kong a lot of the time, as long as they're working. And sometimes if a producer asks you to do a job, you can't turn them down simply because they are that producer. And I'm not talking about the triad influence. I'm just saying maybe based on your previous relationship. Now, this film reminds me... now, if he could have done that all along, why didn't he do it earlier?
Yeah, I think that is one of the questions that runs throughout the whole film. In a way, he's so superhuman. It seems like actually he could have taken the action that he eventually does take, like in the final scenes of the film, right at the beginning. It's hard to know why he has to go through all this suffering. And
what is it? How did that get there? It's just very convenient. Just add in another more human touch to that character. And I think Ricky is really quite a good chap, because even though the geezer tried to kill him twice, and he's feeling sorry for him. Here we go. This is what I'm talking about with the extras. The AD is the assistant director said, point it at the guy in the chains, and they just keep doing it. That's the kind of thing about Hong Kong films which gets them a bad reputation.
Yeah. And now we've got yet another trial of torture that Ricky has to undergo, and it's kind of like the film is building on its excesses. It's kind of
sadism.
Yeah, it is quite a sadistic film, but I think it doesn't leave the viewer kind of feeling too bad about it, simply because, like, in the very next scene, Ricky looks, completely unharmed, and whether there's actually any logic to that, I don't know if that's something that could be, taken from the manga, whether he has some sort of superhuman powers that enables his skin to regenerate or something.
That's the internal kung fu that he was practicing in his room.
Right.
I should just point out that stuntman on the right-hand side of the screen. I worked with him on the film Hitman, a Jet Li movie. And he was Eric Chang's stunt double. He's a little bit, how can we say, he's a little bit porky, but he's a very, very good acrobat. And the reason why they get a stuntman to do a small part like that instead of an extra is because something nasty is going to happen to him, or something. That's the way. Sometimes I find when I watch these movies, you'll see the familiar faces of the stuntmen lurking among the crowds, and you know that an action scene or a bit of violence is coming up. It's in the post. I'm just remembering a funny story. I've got a friend who teaches drama at Hong Kong International School, which is a very expensive private school. And he asked me to come and help him teach some acting classes, and I was there. And the home economics teacher, who's this middle-aged New Zealand woman, the kind of very matronly, very caring, she'd bake cakes and bring them to the staff common room for everyone to share. She found out what I did for a living, and she said, "Oh, can you tell me how to get a copy of this movie, Story of Ricky?" And I said to her, "Why on earth do you want that film?" And she said, "Oh, my daughter's boyfriend's been nagging me to get it." And this is a movie which, obviously, of all the Hong Kong films in the world, this guy in New Zealand wanted to get.
That's kind of interesting. I mean, New Zealand, which is, of course, where Peter Jackson hails from, and Brain Dead being a big success around the same time as this film. So, yeah, the reputation of these films travels easily. As if Ricky being buried underground for the night wasn't enough, they have to add some additional torment to him.
I know, and the torment here that was probably the scene I most objected to in the whole film. I mean, you can do whatever you want to the humans, but don't hurt the doggy. You know, the last film I saw someone kick a doggy was Resident Evil. Mila Jovovich did a nice kick off the wall using a wire, and she booted a dog. And it's interesting to see, though, that while this film seems to be inspired by, let's say, in Hong Kong cinema, the works of Zhang Jie, I think it also owes a lot to the splatter films of George Romero, the zombie movies, the Dawn of the Dead, that kind of thing. We don't see that kind of filmmaking in Hollywood anymore, and I think a lot of that is post-September 11th as well. I mean, Resident Evil is a wonderful idea. It's a zombie film, but just the splatter and the gore and the pure enjoyment of seeing goo splattered all over the lens just doesn't seem correct these days. I'd be very interested to see how people react to Story of Ricky if they're seeing it for the first time with no idea of the reputation which precedes it.
Yeah.
This is a park in Sha Tin. Which, like I said, is just a couple of train stops away from Mongkok, which is central Kowloon.
And this scene really, I suppose, explains the whole movie. I mean, this is where we discover Ricky's motivation for what he's doing.
Yeah, this must have been the other day that Gloria Yip worked on the film. That actor there, supporting actor, not many roles in Hong Kong films. His name's Wong Ji-keung, which is the same name in Chinese as director Kirk Wong, but I can assure you he's a different guy. Just small supporting roles, usually playing a sleazebag. It's a very heavy-handed direction going on here. I don't know if this is meant to be as a result of the drugs or what, but she obviously doesn't like using the stairs.
Oh, not much remorse showed there.
And her face looks in remarkably good condition, considering the way that she hit the ground. Maybe Ricky had been teaching her internal kung fu, but she hadn't yet mastered it. This looks like Chim Sa Choi to me.
It does, yeah.
Chim Sa Choi, that famous, probably the most famous part of Hong Kong. It's in Kowloon, and it's where Chongqing Mansions and the Peninsula Hotel and a lot of the shops that rip off the tourists are to be found. I think these flashback scenes seem to have been shot very hastily, just comprise a few shots, and then they're over and done with. I think the producers and the filmmakers were much more comfortable shooting at their prison sets, because a lot of the time in Hong Kong, especially at this time, filmmakers shot on location at their peril, because If they applied for a permit from the government to shoot in, let's say, a busy tourist area like Censorship, they'd most likely get the permit turned down. So the way to film was to just get out there with your crew, shoot what you could until the police came along, and then go away. And if you needed to get more shots, you came back and did it at another time. I mean, I worked on one very low-budget Hong Kong film that was mostly shot in apartments and interior scenes, not studios. They couldn't afford that, and in fact, to save money, they actually used the same apartment to play, let's say, 2 different apartments. And they just redecorated, re-wallpapered the thing. But it looked exactly the same. You know, different ways of saving money in Hong Kong. A reference there to the Japanese masked rider and Kamen Rider and those kind of superheroes. The posing he's doing with the arm, a bit more something to remind us again that this is Japanese in origin.
There's another instant where I guess most viewers will say, well, why didn't he do that the night before? It's almost like the character actually wants to go through this suffering.
I'm sure if we were more highbrow critics, we'd be looking for some kind of Messiah comparison to be made with Ricky, but I'm not going that way. You know, the cross imagery, the crucifixion and so on. But I don't know.
He does actually have a bruise on his cheek there.
I know, that's something.
It was probably some injury the actor picked up on the set, and they couldn't cover it up rather than...
I should point out at this moment that that's not how William Holgarko's hair usually appears. He actually has a full head of hair. He just has had it cropped that way for the movie. Well, he's got some incredible teeth. That's the kind of thing you only notice on a DVD version of a film. I mean, this room, for example, could be anywhere. It could be the boiler room of the prison or the library where they shot the film. It's very minimalistic. Ow.
I think we have coming up one of the most memorable scenes. One of the moments that inspired one critic to describe this film as perhaps the second goriest movie ever, surpassed only by Peter Jackson's Brain Dead. I probably wouldn't disagree with that.
How do you like that? Thing is, you do wonder what kind of sick mind dreams this stuff up. But it should be said that Lam Lai Choi is no longer directing in Hong Kong. He's emigrated to Australia, so if he gets to work on the Australian soap operas, he might be able to lighten those up a bit.
Though I don't think we'll be seeing scenes such as this appearing in any episodes of Neighbours anytime soon.
Maybe Cell Block H. Now, this guy has to be the most stingiest friend you could have in prison. There's muscle-bound Fan Siu Wong in need of some serious protein, and what does he get? Rice. And once again, I mean, I keep thinking, we know he can smash his way out of those chains. But I guess this is another one of those padding out scenes just to get the running time going and give Ricky all just a little bit more motivation to rupture spleens and split heads.
Yeah, there does seem to be a certain kind of masochistic element to his character. Perhaps, part of the guilt brought on by the death of his girlfriend.
Like Cantonese says "gayao," which is a bit like the Japanese "gambade," which means keep going. So he knows that he's got the prisoners on his side, or at least some of them.
Well, these scenes we see here, obviously, definitely shot in a real prison. I mean, whether this is in the same Macau prison that we see in the exteriors.
It's a prison with a great security system because the prisoners just open the door. I wonder whether they'd been inspired by the Ray Winston film Scum for this. The suicides and the killings and all of that.
I think Scum was a tad more realistic than what we're seeing here.
And I've seen this trick used in quite a few films. I think No Retreat, No Surrender 2, Raging Thunder was one where we saw this. Oh, I think it's worth talking a bit about prosthetic effects in Hong Kong, head casts and so on. Hong Kong doesn't have many people specializing in that kind of special effects. The one man who's best known in Hong Kong for doing that is a makeup artist called Chan Kwok Hong, known as Hong Gore in the film community, Brother Hong. He's been in the business for a long time. He started off as a set decorator or set painter, doing painted backdrops at Shaw Brothers. And then at that time, Shaw Brothers would bring filmmakers from Japan over to teach people at Movie City. And a makeup artist came along and inspired Chan Kwok Hong. And when Raymond Chow set up Golden Harvest, Kwok Hong went over there and started working as Bruce Lee's makeup artist. In fact, you can see him in Game of Death, the finished version of Game of Death. There's that scene where Carl Miller, played by Bob Wall, has just won his kickboxing fight against Sammo Hung. He's a stuntman, Fat Fong. And in the after-fight party or so, there's one reporter, photographer, in the dressing room, wearing Chinese guy with tinted glasses. That's Chan Kwok Hong, Bruce Lee's makeup man, but he's now better known not just for doing conventional makeup, but special effects makeup. And he's got a workshop not far from this dubbing studio where we are now in Kwun Tong, and one in Tin Shui Wai. And he imports a lot of his polymers and gels and so on from the US and also from the UK. And he's basically the best man in Hong Kong for doing those kind of prosthetic makeups. He did a head cast of me once, and it literally involved him applying some kind of fast-forming gel all over my head and just my nose holes to breathe through. And I was basically enclosed for an hour. And when that was done, they got a hammer and tapped on my head and took the cast off. And then they filled that with a gel, and that's how they make these casts of heads, either to form a palette or a basis for them to make the effects that will be added onto the actor's face, but also you can do it to make rubber casts of heads to get splattered on. And he told me he'd done head casts for many famous action actors. He wouldn't name names, who were quite scared by the whole process of being encased in plaster for an hour. And he said some of these kung fu stars are very scared to do it, but actresses aren't. Why is that? I asked him. He said, well, because actresses are usually quite used to doing facial masks at home, and so they're used to being enclosed, and they don't get that claustrophobic feeling. But he specialises. His workshop's quite a scary place. It's not the kind of place you'd want to hang out at night. It's full of what look like severed limbs and entrails, and he did a lot of the special effects makeup for Choi Huck's Wicked City and Green Snake and those kind of movies. He specialises in those. The last TVB adaptation of Journey to the West, Monkey, he did the makeup design for that, the animal effects, the creatures, and so on. I don't know whether he worked on this film, but I assume he did, because there's nobody in Hong Kong really up to his standard. Although this film, I would admit, the effects aren't the best we've ever seen. But Hong Kong's not that advanced at doing special effects makeup. It's a costly and a time-consuming process. Last year, Andy Lau did a film with Sammy Cheng called Love on a Diet, in which he and Sammy Jang piled on the pounds and became rather large and fat and then had to lose the weight. And they actually brought in Hollywood special effects guys to do that, the people who'd worked on Nutty Professor, because they didn't think it could be done in Hong Kong. I don't know whether that's true or whether that was just a good marketing ploy. When we see the explosion there and the debris flies towards the camera, that debris is actually cork. So it looks solid, and it looks like it could be damaging, but if it were to fly into the camera lens or hit a crew member, they're not likely to get hurt. And there's been too many accounts in the West and in Hong Kong of people getting injured from debris from explosions or downtown torpedoes. A bit of debris from an exploding car actually threw 30 feet and tore open the head of an assistant props man. So you need to be careful with explosions. That stuntman we just got killed there, his nickname is Sai Bo, which means little boob or little tit. His big brother is called Dai Bo, big boob. This stuff in the kitchen reminds me of that Robert Ginty movie, The Exterminator. If you're lying, I'll be back, when the mob guy gets put into the mincing machine, legs first.
But this has a far more cartoon quality to it, doesn't it?
In fact, in this day and age, it's almost hard to be offended by this film.
Definitely. I mean, you've got the kid, look at the way he's dressed here. It's kind of adding to the whole, absurdity of it all in a way.
But the action, the actual martial arts, isn't as stylized as a lot of Hong Kong films of this era. I mean, this is 1992. This was around the time of the Once Upon a Time in China movies.
Right.
Yuen Duck was doing movies, Yuen Bu were making movies. And although there's the wire effects of people getting thrown because of their supernatural powers, there's not an awful lot of flying around. This stuff, they don't even bother to undercrank the camera, which means shoot it at 22 frames a second and play it back at 24 to make it faster. Yeah, Hong Kong films do sometimes speed up the action. This stuff's real speed and... a
bit of slow-mo there.
But, some of the slow-mo effects we do see on the film, not that one. We're at it at post-production stage. So they shot it at normal speed of 24 frames a second and slowed it down in the editing stage, which doesn't really have the nice look of, say, shooting at 48 frames a second.
That's right. It looks far more jerky when you do it in post-production.
Which is kind of surprising, considering that the director, Lam Lai Chai, was a director of photography, a veteran director of photography, and would know about camera speeds and that kind of thing. He even shot some of his later films. One of his more successful later films was in his filmography of about 10 movies, his erotic ghost story. Another Category 3, this time a sex movie, as the title suggests, film. It took about 11 million Hong Kong dollars at the box office. Ho Kak-ko doing that stunt himself, which makes you think the wall must have been padded.
Yeah. And it's at this time that the film reaches new heights of
silliness.
Yeah, I guess you could say that.
It reminds me of that scene in Big Trouble in Little China, John Carpenter's film. And this film does remind me of John Carpenter in some ways, where Carter Wong's character, who's a kung fu master with internal power, gets so, how can I say, frustrated, pissed off, that he sort of explodes with internal energy and just inflates and pops. Things looking kind of rubbery there. Those bricks, for example, are going to be foam, because you can't send your star without pads into something like that. And like I said, you can't really get a stunt double for someone like Fan Siu-wong with his physique, and he's taller than a lot of leading men in Hong Kong. This shot off a mini trampoline. When he hits the floor, you can see the pads on the floor, those thin rubber mats.
So all of you watching, you can freeze frame and check it out for yourselves. It really is a quite absurd-looking monster, isn't it? I mean, I'm not quite sure what they were aiming for in this scene.
Yeah, even Hollywood special effects people say that it's tough to get that texture of skin for such a long running piece of film, such a long shot. When people can see that quite plainly it's latex or whatever. One thing they often do is they smear a bit of KY jelly over it. I think that's what they did with the Alien in Ridley Scott's film, just to make it seem a little less rubbery. I think we can safely assume that's not Hokagoi doing this fight scene. It's a stuntman in a ridiculous outfit. I'd love to have known what the atmosphere was like on the set for this film. I imagine people weren't taking it too seriously. Yeah, that's the shot from The Exterminator. I'm thinking about the Jim Glickenhaus film. Glickenhaus, of course, went on to direct Jackie Chan and The Protector.
There's also a similar thing in a film called The Corpse Grinders, made in America back in the 70s, that had a similar effect as well.
Since we're making references, it reminds me of the Pink Floyd video for The Wall. Yeah, they took their time to riot.
Look at that head.
And now Ricky does the thing which we all wondered why he didn't do an awfully long time ago. I told a friend the other day, who's a Hong Kong film fan, I'm doing the audio commentary to Story of Ricky in a few days, and he said, "Oh yeah, the film where the guy punches through the wall." And I think that pretty much sums it up. Or maybe it doesn't. Maybe it's the film where the guy cuts out his own intestines to strangle the hero.
Yeah, I think everybody has their own favourite moments from this film. And there we see Ricky going off into the sunset for another adventure, though not on celluloid, I'm afraid. This was the only live-action Ricky film.
That's right, there were two very popular full-length feature cartoons. The first one told this story, and the other one saw Ricky battling cyborgs on behalf of the military. I think that would have posed a much greater technical challenge for Hong Kong filmmakers back in the early 90s than this film did. Now, after the manga movies ran their course, Hong Kong filmmakers started turning to their own Chinese comic books for inspiration, films that were a lot more tame and had a much broader target audience, films like Storm Riders, based on the comic book Feng Wan, A Man Called Hero, based on the comic book Zhonghua Yinghong, and they starred pretty people like Ekin Cheng and Aaron Kwok, and weren't anything like this film. I think it's fair to say that the story of Ricky is unique.
I think so. I don't think we're ever going to see another one, though you never know. After the recent success of Ichi the Killer, maybe this filmmakers will be inspired to return to the character, and we'll get another story of Ricky. Who knows?
Who cares?